Welcome to the Comic Sauce podcast, where we talk comics and comics culture. I am Henry Liu, and today I'm joined by Rainier. Rainier, how you doing?
Good, Henry. Doing well.
Excellent. And I'm joined by Christian Diadamo. Christian, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Henry. Repping my Batman shirt right now. I'm ready to rumble.
Excellent, excellent. I am also joined by Porfirio Rangel. Porfirio, how goes?
Doing pretty good. I'm really excited. Let's do this.
Let's do this. So today's topic is DC versus Marvel, the age-old debate. But first, real quick, as we mentioned last time, we do have a social media presence now. So we are at Comic Sauce Pod on Twitter and Instagram. So we're just kind of getting that started up. Should be some fun stuff forthcoming. Yeah, check us out online. Another quick note, we posed a question of the week last time related to Godzilla and King Kong. There wasn't a whole lot of response, so we're not going to delve into that particular question. Do check out our last episode where we did deep dive into Godzilla and Kong. But I think maybe we'll put the question of the week on the back burner for now. For today, we're just going to dive right in. Like I said, we're going to talk about DC versus Marvel. So in the pantheon of great rivalries, this is absolutely right in there. Yeah, when we think of Yankees versus Red Sox, Star Wars versus Star Trek, I mean, DC versus Marvel is right up there. Yeah. It's a fun conversation for comic geeks like us. You know, it's just one of those things you can talk about endlessly, right? So that's why I'm thinking this won't be the end all be all episode for this. You know, I think we can touch upon this every now and then. You know, we can revisit. We'll certainly try to cover as much territory as we can this time around. But like I said, it's really an endless conversation. So, where to begin here? Just real quick, a little bit of history. DC Comics was founded in 1934. Marvel Comics was founded in 1939, and it was known as Timely Comics at the time. So we're talking about a couple franchises that have been around for a long time. And we're getting close to like 100 years for these comics companies. So they're definitely part of the American tradition, part of American history. So yeah, there's a lot of history here. You know, when we talk about comic books, DC and Marvel, we tend to talk about more recent stuff, maybe the movies, but there is a long history with both of these companies. You know what we can do right now, I think? I thought it'd be good to sort of just go down the line here and talk about our respective fandom level, right? How much of a DC fan are you? How much of a Marvel fan are you, right? Where do we start here? How about you, Porfirio? Where would you put yourself on the scale for these two entities?
Yeah, I'm definitely 100 Marvel. I've been Marvel fan forever. Um, like, yeah, I guess I lean more towards the movies and TV shows than actual comics. But DC, I do have my love for there. It's opened up these past few years. Um, yeah, DC is getting up there. I'm really excited to just know more about DC and all that kind of stuff, but that's where I'm at so far.
And interestingly for you, your DC fandom is pretty recent, right? Because I remember not that long ago, you were like totally Marvel. Like you would not even acknowledge DC almost, right?
Almost, yeah. Hmm.
So that is interesting. So that might sort of color your answers a bit because, yeah, like we've been saying, I think more recently you've been starting to embrace DC a bit more, right? Right?
Yep, definitely.
Cool. Okay, how about you, Rainier? Where do you fall in this spectrum?
Ooh, what a loaded question.
Yeah.
Actually, I do want to touch upon Porfirio, your comment about, or Henry, about how you've noticed how over time you've noticed he's started to grow an appreciation for DC. I feel like I've seen the same too, because I've been sort of periodically off and on this show.
Mhm.
I definitely see the same too, Porfirio, and that's really cool. And I think that's what fandom's all about, is like discovering new things, and that's super cool. Where do I stand? Oh, man. So like I've said this to everybody that I why not both? Like, why does it have to be versus, right? I mean, the way I see it, it's like iPhone versus Android. I mean, both phones can make calls, they can text message, they can send emails, they accomplish the same things. At the end of the day, they're a phone.
True.
At the end of the day, they're still comics. Um, I want to say though, but I own an iPhone, right? So in this case, I own DC. I lean a little bit more DC, but admittedly, I love both Marvel and DC. I want to say DC is a little closer to my heart, just because I've really followed the comics, television series, movies. Um, Man, I think there was just a time where I was just hungry for anything DC content, that I was just consuming it like crazy. And now that we're all spoiled to every single summer having several blockbuster like Marvel or DC movies, like now it's you can find it on every street corner. It's so abundant.
Yeah.
Um, but I love it both. I lean a little more DC, a little more sentimental there, to me. But why not both? I love both.
Cool. Yeah, I like that perspective because, you know, the the world is so divided right now. Why do we need yet another thing to be divided on, right? Why not embrace both sides? I
And
dig that.
I know it's like, what a safe answer, but I really can't, like, I mean, there's things I love and hate about Marvel. There's things I love and hate about DC. They both come with their own, but you could make the argument that Marvel and DC wouldn't be where they are today if it wasn't for each other.
That is exactly what I was thinking. The rivalry makes both companies better. You brought up the iPhone Android thing, same thing. There's a rivalry there, and the better one is, the better the other is. There's like a cool competition type thing going on, right? So, yeah, I think DC makes Marvel better and Marvel makes DC better. So, better together. Hell yeah. All right. How about you, Christian? Where do you fall in this spectrum of fandoms?
All right. So I definitely fall more into the DC camp than the Marvel camp. I think growing up around like late '90s, early 2000s, it was really like the DC cartoons, like Justice League, Batman, Superman, that I think gave me that big initial push into DC fandom. Uh, and so that's kind of, I guess that's largely where I've stayed. I think growing up, I also did love Spider-Man the animated series. Um, although for some reason I never latched on to X-Men in I guess the same way. Whatever place and time, love them now. But like I didn't really. There was a lot of Marvel characters I actually didn't really truly look at and think, "Wow, this is a great character. I really got to read more of that." Until like the movies actually started coming out, the big MCU movies, because I think I definitely fall into that DC camp of Bat fanboy. I think I am wearing my Batman shirt. Most of my collection is Batman, and like I've seen like every Batman movie however many times. So I guess that's where I'm personally at.
Excellent. Okay, and myself, rounding it out, I certainly fall into the Marvel camp. So yeah, uh, as you can see, we're kind of evenly distributed here, right? So myself and Porfirio lean Marvel, Christian and Rainier lean DC. And we always wanted to have this conversation anyway, so it's perfect now, right? We're kind of evenly balanced. Perfect time to talk it up. But yeah, a little bit of history. Uh, I did enter the Marvel fandom through comic books. Child of the '80s. Yeah, I really got into Iron Man and Punisher comics in the '80s, and have never looked back. Yeah, been a Marvel fan ever since. Interestingly, as I've mentioned previously on the show, I was a DC fan prior, in my young life. Um, I got into some DC cartoons and toys as a little kid. Yeah, I mentioned the Superpowers series. Yeah, I was really into that series, the cartoon series and the toys. So yeah, the topic of sentimentality that comes up a bit. I have a place in my heart for DC for sure. But yeah, it really is Marvel all the way for me now, though. So there we are. I think we have a pretty good diverse range of fandom here. So should be a good conversation. Okay, at this point, I'm going to continue to sort of moderate the conversation, but it should be a conversation. I think it'll be pretty open. Feel free to jump in whenever. Um, but I thought I might start with just some of the kind of the low hanging fruit of it all, like the stuff that comes up most often when these types of discussions take place, right? Um, so with the comics, and it really started with the comics, a lot of what I hear in the debates is DC came first. Like I mentioned, literally DC came first. It was founded several years prior to Marvel. And, in a lot of ways, Marvel is kind of a follow-up, a takeoff, a knockoff of DC, if you will, right? We've talked about Thanos being kind of a ripoff of Darkseid. So what do you guys think of that? When you hear that come up, oh, DC came first. Like, how much weight does that hold? Is that like a big deal, or is it just kind of meaningless? How do you guys feel about that?
I think it's a big deal. I think in general, a lot of people know that Superman was like the first superhero,
Yeah.
Like no question, like he was the first superhero, and like he set the standard for what superheroes were back then. Like that didn't exist before Superman.
Solid point. I do agree. It does matter. Like, it's not nothing. Like, who came first does matter. Like, know your history, respect. Superman was the first superhero, and you could make a strong argument that superheroes that followed Superman were all in some way a takeoff of him, right?
Yeah, I would definitely say like there's like a little bit of Superman's DNA in like just about every superhero. You could almost argue, um, and how he's like kind of like the most like idealized version of like the superhero like trope and the superhero character, and like and then there's also the Superman movie, which was like kind of when it came out in the 70s was one of the big movies to like create the blockbuster. Like the block, but like they say it started with Jaws, but I would say it's like a punch of Jaws, Star Wars, and Superman are like the three movies that really made it take off. And now you have I think Kevin Feige says that he wants every director that he brings in to watch the Donner Superman to get like a full idea of what he wants in his Marvel movies.
Oh, someone did their homework here because that's a really solid counterpoint because we're going to get into this later, but on the Marvel side of things, a lot of folks cite the more recent movies, right? They're the big knockout punch for Marvel, right? But if you're saying even Kevin Feige himself is recommending to his filmmakers that they watch a DC movie before they make their movie, that's a strong point.
And even to add to Superman being the first, I mean, Justice League, I think, was the first like superhero team up crew, right? They were the first like shared universe.
Yeah, that's solid because that's the big thing now, right? The team up. It isn't just the Justice League or the Avengers. I mean, there are so many different teams of superheroes. And yeah, Justice League was the first.
Robin was the first sidekick.
Definitely. So what about the counter argument? Like if let's say Marvel fans hear time and again, DC came first, then what do we as Marvel fans say to that? Any thoughts, Porfirio?
Yeah, the only argument I could say besides like, DC came first, respect where the original source came from, I guess like it's that like Marvel can like kind of like improved and made something different from an original idea from DC. Um, like Rainier said, Superman was the first superhero, and while Spider-Man he was not the first superhero, but like he was like I think the first superhero that like Stanley made that was relatable. He had superpowers, but he was also like a person who had like all these like everyday issues of like getting money and going to school and stuff like that. Like so I think like Marvel, what they did better was just like creating characters that were more relatable than DC.
Oh man, I love that point because yeah, well, it's a strong argument to say DC came first. It's also a strong argument to say over time you have to adapt, right? You have to adjust with the times, you have to adjust with different mediums. And a strong argument for Marvel is that they have done so well with adjusting. So a big seismic change was in the 60s, right? And a lot of people talk about Stan Lee, but his contributions to the world really happened in the 60s, where he changed the game. He took superheroes into a whole different direction and really changed everything. You could argue again in more recent times with the MCU that similar to how Marvel changed the comic book medium in the 60s, in the late 2000s, they changed the movie medium, right? And again, they completely turned it on its head and created something completely new, and people like totally bought into it, right? The numbers don't lie, box office, comic book sales, all that, right? So yeah, I love that sentiment, Porfirio, that you could argue that DC came first, but Marvel very arguably has done better in kind of changing things up when like at key moments in time. Yeah, adjusted with the times.
I don't know if I'd say better. I'd say innovated. I feel like I'd say innovation. Like they definitely like, yeah. I mean, they added like more color and nuance to their characters, making them look like real people with real problems that like readers could relate to.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, not necessarily better, but certainly innovative, right? I think you can't argue the innovations that Marvel has done. So that brings us to another pretty common point. So with the 60s, the silver age of comics, the Marvel age, yeah, we saw a new type of superhero, with Stan Lee creating the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, like particularly Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, I would say you saw this really refreshing relatability in superheroes, right? They weren't these godlike figures so much as they were people you might know, people you can relate to, people you can identify with. And that's a big argument point for Marvel, right? A lot of Marvel fans are saying, well, the DC superheroes are great and all, but like I can't relate to them. They tend to be godlike figures. And this, in the same way that I can feel like Peter Parker is just like me, because I have trouble managing my money and taking care of my family, and my relationship life is like a disaster. I don't have that connection with the DC characters. What do you guys think about those topics?
I think that's a little bit of a gray area. I remember Jim Lee talking about how he made some comment at a convention saying, if there's anyone out there that can relate to Batman, they are a psychopath.
True.
So I don't know, like, I don't feel like I necessarily have to relate to a character to enjoy them. Like Batman's my favorite character, and by no means am I a billionaire or do I have a bat cave under my house.
Mm-hmm.
He's just a cool character.
Yeah.
With an awesome rogues gallery, and there's just a lot of dimension and darkness to his character. Yeah.
Good point.
I guess like as far as like relatability with DC characters, like I always feel like even though they have this like kind of godlike status that you kind of like look up to, like Superman, I feel like there is definitely a relatability there, but it might just be in I don't want to say like smaller or more diminished aspects, but I think that there's always something that you can connect with in say like their plight, like I'm not this dark and brooding billionaire with like Batman, but I think there is something kind of relatable in how in overcoming adversity and being the best man that you can be. Like there's something kind of cool watching like Batman be this super awesome superhero, but he's just a regular guy. But he kind of has this mythical figure status to people think, does this guy have superpowers? Does he? Like, is he a metahuman? Whereas no, he just kicks that much ass. Like, and then Superman is not really, he's not a human, but it's kind of that question: is human something you're born with, or is like human something you like grow up to be? It's like kind of, we were talking something similar in our Blade Runner episode with the idea of the soul and what is the soul. And in a real sense, maybe Clark Kent is more human than the rest of us, even if he isn't, because he has his moral standard that he lives up to. And there's something I think very heartwarming about reading a good Superman story.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that about Superman. That's right. Like he's like comics like he, what do they call him? Like he's basically an immigrant that had come from another planet, right?
Yeah.
And he's trying to find his way, find a life here on Earth that's not his native home. And he's trying to just fit in with these crazy, incredible powers.
Yeah, it's cool. I can't remember what panel it was, but I remember at a convention panel, there was some discussion about Superman along these lines, where they were talking about the relatability of heroes. And the panelist was supporting Superman. He was saying, well, yeah, you yourself, aren't Superman. But when we look at Superman, we can kind of see like the best in humanity. Like here's a person who is gifted with these great powers, and yet he always does the right things. He's not self-serving, right? So he's almost like a blueprint for how we should behave, right? Because sadly, so often when people come into a lot of money, a lot of power, they abuse it, right? But Superman doesn't. And for, of anyone, he would be the one to do it because he has these godlike powers, right? So when you look at Superman, you should feel good about Superman, and and just recognize his actions as being the right thing to do and that sort of thing. But yeah, like along the lines of what we were saying before, it's not really better or worse. When I think of this topic, it's more like kind of gives me a little insight on the person. Like, what kind of person are you? I mean, it's not so black and white as, oh, a DC person thinks this way and a Marvel person thinks that way. But I think there's a little something there, right? Where I think a DC person may want to look at these fictional characters as something more aspirational, maybe something escapist, like what you're saying, Rainier. Like, I'm not Batman, but he's cool. I dig like watching Batman and reading Batman comics and stuff. So there's this cool escapist element, whereas maybe a Marvel fan they might enjoy a story where they can kind of put themselves into the shoes of the character, right? It can depend on the character too, like there are a lot of Marvel characters who do have godlike powers and maybe aren't so relatable, maybe a character like Thor, right? But just in general, I think there's more of a relatability factor. And yeah, I think there's a little window to a person's way of thinking when you hear what kind of stuff they're into. DC versus Marvel for sure, I think, is an indicator of things.
So who do you relate to more, Henry? DC people or Marvel people?
Oh, that's talk about a loaded question there.
That's for all of you guys. That's for all of you guys.
Talking about, choosing
this
sides.
decides the friendship right here.
Going down, gotta take the gloves off.
Oh man. So wait, who do what type of person would I relate to more? A DC or Marvel person? Yeah. Man. Well, I just I mean, this is maybe a kind of weak answer, but someone I can talk Marvel to, probably I can relate to more, just just logically, right? Yeah, it just it's like when you go to conventions. So that's why I miss going to conventions so much, because you are hanging out with like-minded people, right? So there's something to that, like-minded people. So yeah, maybe not the greatest answer, but yeah, I relate to Marvel people more for sure.
There are certainly people that get really hostile with their fandoms.
Oh yeah.
People that will defend their favorite superhero, saying it's the best and you can't convince me otherwise.
Okay, great transition. So one of the topics I had was the fan base. So I think both sides have problematic fans, so what do we think about some of these fans who might take things a little too seriously?
I think the learning curve for people that have dove into the Marvel fandom is much lower than the learning curve for DC, just because of the movies.
Yeah.
Because someone has seen all the MCU movies that has never read a comic is suddenly an expert on Marvel comics. And I hate that.
I think you nailed it. Oh, go ahead, Porfirio.
Yeah, I was gonna say, piggyback off what Rainier said. It is really annoying when like a Marvel fan says like WandaVision, for example. Like, so many people watch that show, and then there's so many other like Marvel fans who have been watching the movies for a long time saying like, oh, don't call yourself a Marvel fan if you're just watching WandaVision. That's it. Like, you have to watch all these other ones. You have to do this, you have to do that. It's just like, no, you don't have to do anything. You just watch one thing and just say you're a Marvel fan, you know? There's like no like requirement or whatever to what makes a fan, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just it's it's just so annoying. It was so annoying to watch this.
I'm not trying to be like, I'm not trying to be like a comic elitist. Like you can't love Marvel movies just because you haven't seen or read a Marvel comic. But it's like if you love these characters and you're that passionate about it, why don't you pick up a comic and pay homage to the creators that have put it together, you know?
Mm-hmm. That's a solid point. Yeah, I think there's a fine line here. There is a whole like gatekeeper aspect of things where, yeah, certainly we want to be the type to say, oh, you can't consider yourself a fan if you haven't read the comics, or you don't deserve to watch these movies before you read the comics or something like that, right? But at the same time, I get it. I get what you guys are saying. It can be kind of aggravating where, someone has seen a couple Avengers movies and they've self-declared themselves as like experts and longtime Marvel fans or something like that, right?
I mean, is that kind of the equivalent of like a sports like fair weather fan? Like
Oh
every time I
yeah.
see like an Oakland A's like or a Warriors like authentic fan, I always look at those banners. I'm like, authentic fan. So if I'm a fan today and I'm holding this sign, am I an authentic fan? Or if I held
Yeah.
if I held this sign like 10 years ago, am I more of an authentic fan? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
What qualifies as authentic fan?
Yeah. There's definitely like this bandwagon thing, which is kind of complicated. On one hand, it can be very annoying, but like older school fans, we shouldn't have the point of view that you can't consider yourself a fan unless you've like done your time or something. So I don't know, it's complicated. I think it's got to be somewhere in the middle.
Wait, who's a diehard Star Wars fan here? Like that has read books and all that stuff.
Well,
Anyone?
see, there you go. When you say Die Hard, that's a sticky
Yeah.
label right there. I mean, I think all four of us are Star Wars fans. I don't
I
think
guess
there's
I'm a
any
Star Wars
question
fan.
about it. Yeah, hell yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a Star Wars fan.
Yeah. I've
I'm
read
just-
one book.
So I'm just curious because this came up when we were at a convention. This guy that was trying to like school us on like Star Wars like trivia. Are any of you guys aware of like different styles of lightsaber fighting?
Only from this guy we talked to in here.
I'm just curious. Yeah,
I
mean-
know actually.
What do you mean?
it would be the equivalent of like tiger style and crane style. You know what I mean? Like apparently there's like 6 different schools of lightsaber fighting that Jedi's like base their training off of. And that's a deep cut. Like I didn't know that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now am I no longer an authentic Star Wars fan because I didn't know that?
Yeah, I
That's a good point. Yeah.
I forgot who said it, but in this topic of like how much of a fan you are, the sentiment was you're a fan if you like it, period. Doesn't matter if you've read the comics, watched the shows, watched the movies. Doesn't matter if you like it, you're a fan, done deal. But I think there's something to people like us who've kind of put our time in. It is kind of annoying where a newer fan is dismissive of older fans. I think that's what we're getting at here, right? If you're a newer fan and you're cool and you recognize older fans and show a little respect, that's cool. But if you're just like, oh, like I love the MCU, everything else that has come out is bullshit. I don't care about like some comic books that came out in the 30s as ancient history. Fuck you. Like that's not cool, right? So yeah, I think that the obnoxiousness factor is a big part of it. And that's a good segue into the DC side of fandom, where it's almost the opposite. I mean, this is kind of a stereotype, but with the Marvel fan, we're kind of painting here. It's the new fan who's gotten into it just because of the MCU and doesn't really acknowledge the history of it, doesn't acknowledge older school fans. Then there's DC fans who there's a stigma there, right? That DC fans are the older school fans who are very set in their ways, we could say. The release the Snyder Cut people, and the people who are very against seeing any changes in their characters whatsoever. Yeah, what do you think about this sort of DC fan stigma?
Yeah, that I
You're
think
making us
that's
sound like
something we've
old
also-
farts.
Yeah. You're kind of right. Like, it's something you have seen like on the internet, like, in quite a few places. And I guess I guess one thing I guess I'll give to Marvel, I guess we all know, is Marvel just generally sells more than DC. Like, if you look at just general comic sales, if you look at the massive runaway success of the MCU versus
Ooh, I don't know about Marvel comics selling more than DC. I remember Aton actually making a comment about that, about how DC's like sales number or sales figures have been much higher than Marvel.
recently. Oh, interesting. Because I looked at some charts. Check out. I know Wikipedia isn't always the greatest source, but it's always like you kind of look at the internet and see like who sells more, and many of them generally I've seen Marvel sells more. Just over, I guess, this could be over the course of probably since Marvel kind of came out.
Maybe it was a
but
season.
It could, yeah. It probably is also something that depends on the season, the book, the specific. There's a lot more nuance to it than I think. I guess what I'm getting at here, but is I think that I think the fan base is just probably also just a little smaller, and I think because of that, you have the more longtime fans, and I think some of the kind of old fart gatekeepy attitudes may probably creep up a little more, or a little less, depending on I guess like the topic, and I guess the general scope of the fan base. And so, but of course, I think it's also kind of a double-edged sword, where you have this like tight you have some very tight-knit communities around some characters that may have not got their time in the sun, or may have only started getting their time in the sun recently. Characters like Aquaman it was always known as like the worst superhero for a long time. But he had a very strong core fan base, the people that loved Aquaman, and now we have Jason Momoa as Aquaman, like in Justice League, and like he's really like brought Aquaman into this kind of new light. And so I think we're starting to see like the fan base start to grow, and I think over time, I think a lot of those like kind of attitudes that we've seen before start to kind of fade away. I guess that's my take of what I've kind of generally seen, and like I said, like browsing around the internet.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time where I remember, like, when DC killed a character, they were dead. Like, I know, like, Barry Allen was gone he was not the Flash for a very long time. Like, Hal Jordan wasn't in Green
Jason
Lantern for a very long time.
Todd,
Jason
yeah.
Todd, like, they stayed dead. And that was something that I actually appreciated, that, like, yeah, the mantle had gotten passed down. But characters that died, you weren't expecting them to just pop up the following year in some big, like, maxi series like storyline, although that's kind of changed recently. But that was something that I appreciated about DC. Like, there was like a legacy, like these characters like had legacies that carried down.
That is true, yeah. Like, that is one thing I do love about DC, is just kind of these very long legacies, the different Robins, a new legacy character that I think is starting to become one of my favorite new characters is Superman's son, John.
I feel
Very
like
cool.
one thing I like, I mean, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but like DC fans I feel like are more loyal. Like, like the films weren't that great, but like, that doesn't mean that DC fans don't love the character or whatever. They just hate the movies and they're just still like, I'm still gonna go buy the comics or watch the movies when the films come out or whatever. Um, yeah.
I
Yeah.
think the reason why that is because like I think a lot of longtime DC fans are originally fans from the comics, and it's like put out whatever animated series you want, put out whatever television series you want. My Batman lives in the comics, and so it's like you can change it all you want, but Batman lives in pages for me. Maybe that's what it is. Whereas like a lot of MCU fans, it's like the only Captain America they know is Chris Evans, and Tony
Mhm.
Stark is RDJ, and that's who they will be forever. Which at some point they're going to revive those franchise. I'm sure of it, right?
Yeah.
Who's going to be the new Iron Man? Who's going to be the new Captain
Oh,
America? So it puts people those fans of those actors in a sticky situation. I feel like.
Well, yeah, like we have a new Captain America and Falcon and Winter Soldier, and everybody's already hating him.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah, I like that sentiment. You know, with newer fans, the mentality of associating an actor to a character is there. But if you're a fan since the comics, your connection is more to the comics, right? So there isn't as much weight, like, oh, if they make a shitty Spider-Man movie, and there have been some, right? Um, it doesn't matter because you know I love Spider-Man comics, and I will always love Spider-Man comics, right? So, of course, when the movie's coming out, you hope for the best, obviously, but it's not the end all be all, right? Spider-Man 3 didn't like eliminate my Spider-Man fandom, right? Far from it, absolutely. Okay, so what else comes up? So I think a big one is diversity. This comes up a lot, particularly from the Marvel camp. And yeah, so where an argument could be made that DC came first, an argument can also be made that Marvel came first with diversity in characters, right? Um, the first ever mainstream Black superhero is Black Panther, period. The first ever mainstream African American superhero is Falcon, period. The first ever Black superhero to start his own series is Luke Cage, period. All Marvel, right? And I think it's not a coincidence. Stan Lee was a very progressive thinker, and there's a reason why Marvel has continued to kind of lead the way with diverse storytelling, diverse characters. You look at these Disney Plus shows, we're starting to see diversity behind the camera. Very cool. And there's kind of this rich tradition there. I don't think Marvel is, well, I know Marvel is not free from problematic storylines and characters in their long history, obviously. But they've taken risks. They've gone there. The characters I mentioned are from the 60s and 70s, but look at Miles Morales. That there's that whole um, influx of diverse heroes that followed, the female Thor, female Hawkeye, a Black Captain America, you name it, right? And I remember at the time that it was pretty controversial. There were a lot of angry comics fans when they started to roll out these diverse heroes, right? Um, Not to say DC is completely free of that, but I think an argument can certainly be made that Marvel has kind of won the diversity battle through the years. Thoughts on that?
I definitely think like that point, we'll go to Marvel with characters like Black Panther. I also think that the X-Men were all like a big part of that, and
Yeah.
like characters like Magneto, like a bad guy that lived through the Holocaust and that shaped his understanding of the world. Um, but I think there is one point that should go to DC with a character, and I think that character is the champion of feminism, Wonder Woman, a character that goes back to the 30s, and is a character that is crossed over into being this like mainstream icon of feminism for like pretty much for however long she's been around.
Good call on that one.
Solid.
I mean, I was gonna admittedly say like all the Justice League characters are white. Like, what can we what can we say?
On that point, it is worth noting that the Justice League movie, Whedon or Snyder, it got more diverse. They brought in a Pacific Islander Aquaman, a Jewish Flash, right? And of course, Wonder Woman is there. So yeah, as we've been saying, all things are kind of leaning towards this move towards diversity and representation, which is cool. I would just say that Marvel has kind of led the way in that department.
But it also is in conjunction with the times that these comics had come out. I mean, like the 30s. I mean, it wasn't segregation in the U.S. still a thing? Like,
oh yeah,
in U.S. history, like I don't know the exact dates, but like that was still a thing, I think, back then, right? Like, so I think it's also the timing of when they came out. I think in the 60s, I think that's yeah. I think there was more of an opportunity to be able to like break through that barrier just because of the times.
that's a good point. Yeah, it's not like Stanley was coming up with this stuff out of nowhere. There was the whole civil rights movement going on in the 60s, right? So you could argue that he was doing it kind of to take advantage of it, to capitalize on a movement, right? But I don't think there's any question that he was taking a risk when he introduced Black Panther to the world. When we get to Luke Cage, it started to get into exploitation territory a bit, but I don't think there's any question that Black Panther was a bold move. And for him to do that character at that time, yeah, pretty gutsy. All right, so yeah, we can move forward in time a bit. We've been talking a lot about history, so what about more recent stuff? What about TV? We haven't really touched upon TV a whole lot. There has been a lot of Marvel and DC television throughout the decades, right? One argument I have heard in the past is that yeah, maybe Marvel wins in terms of the movies, certainly in recent times, but DC kind of takes it with the TV shows. I don't know if I buy into that too much, but I don't know. Curious about your guys' thoughts about the TV offerings.
Oh, you don't know if you buy that? I'm curious as to why that is.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just because I'm such a Marvel head, but I never really got into the CW stuff. I think around that time, that's when there was a lot of momentum for this, like DC over Marvel in the TV department, and I just never really got into those shows. Yeah.
I mean, I think Batman the Animated Series is like, I mean, that was a critically awarded like show and very groundbreaking for the type of show that it was. I mean,
Yeah.
I feel like DC television animation at that time, like that, I mean, that even today, like when I still watch it, it's like, wow, this is really amazing stuff. And it drives into the core of like what Batman is, and the way that like Bruce Timm, like, painted such like beautiful stories under such like dark and dynamic conditions. Like it was awesome. I mean, as a kid watching that, I was like, wow, this is great. And then like fast forward to Smallville, I thought that was pretty groundbreaking. I mean, I don't think the idea of like a Superman show where we're not watching Superman, but we're watching Clark Kent grow up. I mean, this dives back to Christian's comment about like the humanity of Superman and making him relatable, right? Like who would have thought that like diving into this small piece of Superman. I mean, I think it's like less than a few pages in the original Superman book where you see the history of Superman in Smallville. Suddenly he's Superman, and they flesh it out into this entire series of seeing him grow up and be the person who he is, who becomes Superman. Like that was awesome. And then that growing into like Green Arrow, I never would have imagined Green Arrow would have his own television series, let alone it like spawning the Flash and like Black Lightning and Supergirl and Lois and Clark, or the new Superman and Lois. Like, and then, you know, taking cues from the MCU and building a universe on television. Like, it's awesome.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. And when they did the Crisis crossovers, that almost made me want, or that almost made me feel like, oh damn, I wish I had watched those shows and I could really enjoy the crossovers, right? But yeah, solid points.
What's cool about Smallville, you see the evolution of it from season 1 to its final season, and I feel like it got better as it continued. Like it aged like a fine wine. Like it got more into its comic booky roots. Like we saw more superheroism in the later seasons of Smallville, rather than just seeing like Clark as like, you know, an angsty kid.
Right on.
Rainier, which shows have you watched from the CW universe?
Smallville. Well, I've seen all of them. Although I am like way behind. It got to a point. I mean, they have so many shows now. Like they have Stargirl and all the DC like online content, like Swamp Thing, Doom Patrol. There's just so much stuff. Like it got to a point where I realized, oh my God, there's a superhero television show every night of the week. Like if you would have asked like my college me at that time, I would be getting no sleep watching everything and loving every single minute of it. But I don't
Nice.
have that time anymore. And so it's really hard to like catch up on it. So like watching superhero, like watching like Invincible, it's like 45 minutes, right? Like that's great. And it's delivering everything that I want to see. But having to go back and try and, I mean, I know at some point I'm going to catch up, but it's hard. There's just so much. And like there's specific timelines in these shows. I almost don't know like where to pick back up. So I think if you were to start watching these series, I think it can be intimidating because there's so much to catch up on. And like where would you start?
Yeah.
I think the easy answer to that is just pick a superhero and then just watch that series first.
Mm-hmm.
Then pick the next one, then watch that next.
Cool. Hey, so Porfirio, I know you're a big Marvel TV guy. I think you've watched more Marvel TV than I have. Are there particular Marvel shows that you've loved throughout the years?
Yeah, for sure. Agents of Shield and Daredevil.
Mm.
But those are just like two. I feel like, yeah, I think DC does have the edge on TV just because I always hear people talking about like, yeah, like their years and that there's just so much content out there for DC that, you know, like it's a lot like it's either a big success or it could be like a fail because there's just so much out there. And I think DC just has so much content that people love it more. Whereas Marvel, they just either have like Netflix or they have Agents of Shield, and now they're starting to delve into their Disney Plus content.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, you know, like just Netflix alone, I don't think can really, you could give the edge to TV just on the Netflix shows alone. Like I think, yeah, like what Rainier was saying, like looking back at all the shows DC has put out there, like there's just probably a lot more better content and they're killing it with their TV. Just
Yeah.
like Marvel is for the movies. Like they put out a lot, you're probably killing it. DC, they're putting out a lot into their TV and they're killing it.
I don't know if I consider like the Marvel stuff on Netflix TV. To me, they were just long. It was like one long movie because they would just throw every single episode one night and you could binge all of it if you really wanted to. Whereas like, you know, all the CW stuff, you got to wait till the next week to see it. Like even the DC stuff that they put on online, like Harley Quinn, all that stuff, like it's a week by week show. So they'll leave you with a cliffhanger and you got to wait.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I really loved those Marvel Netflix shows, but I didn't watch them like TV, like you normally watch TV, right? Episodically, week to week. Like those shows, man, most of the time I would burn through those like opening weekend. I'd watch like fucking like 10, 11, 12, 13 episodes over like a 3-day stretch. You know, it's crazy.
I think I hated that actually because like I can't do that. And I come into work the next day and someone's already spoiling the entire like series for me.
Oh.
Yeah, those were strange times. I mean, I missed the hell out of Marvel Netflix, but yeah, an odd aspect was that whole binge watching thing. It made for a unique experience for sure. But yeah, for Marvel TV, I did really want to highlight those shows because for me, it really complemented the MCU movies really well. They were like all the good stuff that you didn't see from the movies. Like you get the R-rated content, more adult oriented stories, grittier characters, and yeah, characters that were sort of meant to be in like edgier type shows. And I would argue too that, you know, where DC storylines went that the MCU movies didn't, like darker stuff, particularly like Dark Knight territory. You know, I think finally with those Netflix shows, Marvel was able to get into like the dark alleyways, the darker side of humanity. You know, very cool. Like the Punisher, Daredevil, all that stuff. Loved it. You know, so yeah. Who am I to say like who wins the championship belt for TV? I mean, there's just so much content, but I think, you know, Marvel Netflix, it's kind of like this is this forgotten thing now, right? But man, I love the hell out of those shows. And looking ahead, I think it's cool that Disney Plus is taking Marvel TV into pretty cool new territory, right? The shows are quite different, and yeah, they are not super ultra violent like those Netflix shows, but certainly adult oriented.
I feel like Disney Plus is closer to TV than Marvel Netflix was because we have to wait every week.
Yeah, that's a good point. For sure. Okay, so I think a logical progression here would be to get into the movies. We talked TVs. What about movies? Again, a long, rich history on both sides. Yeah, DC and Marvel have been cranking out superhero movies for quite some time now. What do we think about the movie offerings?
Here we go. Bring it on, MCU.
I mean, it has to be said that this is like the number one argument. You know, it's almost like the too easy argument that Marvel movies are awesome and DC movies
MCU,
suck.
mic drop. That's it. That's all I have to say.
3 letters.
And good night. We'll see you next week.
So yeah, like the proof is in the pudding, right? The box office with the MCU is like astronomical. Critics love the MCU. It's definitely not one of these things where like they're big box office, but they're not getting critical acclaim. It's getting both. And it's like the trifecta, right? The fans are loving it too, right? The fans, the critics, and the box office are through the roof. it's a phenomenon, right? And it's arguably why the profile of superhero content has been leveled up to a huge degree for everyone, right? Not just Marvel. So what can be said? Like, what's the counter argument to the MCU? Like, how can you sort of argue against it?
Remember that thing I brought up last week about the term Mick Marvel?
Yeah.
You guys want to elaborate on that a little bit more? Like, how do you guys feel about that term Mick Marvel? I mean, I know like in the past I've talked about how like it's very Marvel-y. Like, of course, we're going to love it. It's going to be everything that Marvel is going to deliver because we're expecting it. But now there's that term Mick Marvel that like the expectation is already built in, and yeah, it's going to be awesome. Like everyone's going to love it.
Yeah, I would say to that I think there was a certain template, a certain way that these movies were made, which for a time I think felt very familiar, like you were sort of getting the same thing over and over. There would be some differences, like Captain America, the First Avenger. Oh, this is a period movie. It takes place before, but essentially we're seeing good versus evil. We get this big climax at the end. And yeah, a lot of those earlier movies, I think, did follow a certain template. But I think the big argument against that is, like we've been saying, Marvel evolves, right? I think the MCU is definitely part of that. Like, here's a great example: the Black Panther movie. So you could argue that that movie followed the Marvel formula, right? We had a character who we could kind of relate to. He has this sort of he's conflicted, right? How to proceed, and we can sort of relate to his motivations, and it kind of leads into this big climactic battle, right? But just the way it was presented and the way it was made with the such a diverse crew and cast, you can't argue that that movie was groundbreaking in every goddamn way, right? So there, I think there's an evolution, and I think we're continuing to see that. Okay, we're with Disney Plus, we're not. It's not the movies, it's the shows, but I think the shows are really showing that they're taking the MCU in a bold new direction, right? So yeah, I would agree earlier on that there was something of a template they were following, a McMarvel, whatever you want to call it. But I do think there's a progression, you know, around, I don't know, maybe around Guardians of the Galaxy, thereabouts, they just started to take risks, and there was a different look and feel to a lot of these movies.
I would like to challenge you on that comment. Like, I agree with everything you say about Black Panther. It's probably one of my favorite MCU movies. But of all the MCU movies, there's one Black Panther movie. What's another movie that's just as groundbreaking within the pantheon of all the other MCU movies?
Well,
and I know we have more stuff to come out, but
yeah.
What do we have now?
But of what came out, yeah, I think it depends on the perspective. You know, you could argue that Infinity War and Endgame were, you know, a very kind of fan servicey, big, huge blockbuster entertainment type.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are
right?
I think those are kind of outliers, because that was kind of like the payoff after 10 years of Marvel movies, right?
Yeah.
But like, I guess maybe the individual movies, like what had that level of impact that Black Panther had?
Well,
I mean,
yeah, I mean, if you're asking me to say, is there another Black Panther? I would say there isn't. It's such a unique phenomenon, right? But as I was about to say, I think Infinity War and Endgame, and I would say especially Infinity War, are groundbreaking in their own way. You know, like I remember watching Infinity War and just waiting to see if it was going to follow the same stuff. And then boom, right away, you see like Heimdall and Loki killed, right? and I knew right away that they were doing something different. You know, they were giving us like 2.5 hours of pain and torture and like ripping our hearts apart, right? And I felt like they were just doing something different right there. um and you know, the feeling I had at the end of Infinity War was very different from the 2012 Avengers, right? That was like a party, you know, a celebration, and my heart was broken at the end of Infinity War. So um yeah, like there's, I mean, that's my best example for like a totally different type experience right there.
I mean, what I have to say about like the MCU, the failure of it is that like it's, too much can just be like a fatigue of it, like Marvel at this point has to do something new, something fresh. And not to say like the Disney, like we just talked about TV, but like WandaVision, for example, like it was totally something new that people hadn't seen, and people were getting frustrated with it because it was too new. And then I enjoyed it. And then coming back to like something like Falcon and Winter Soldier, I was just kind of like, oh, this is kind of like typical Marvel, like just blockbuster action kind of scenes. So I feel like, yeah, if Marvel wants to continue the success, it has to take risks and do something new and not lean into the same formula of like superhero introduced, big challenge, overcoming that challenge, blockbuster action, explosives, and then move on to the next film.
I do agree that Marvel needs to continue to pivot, continue to adapt. Yeah, like
I feel
any
like
great thing, they can fall into that trap of doing the same thing over and over. They need to continue what they're doing.
I feel like the best way they can continue to evolve is not to rest so heavily on the past characters that we've already seen, like leaning too much into all of the continuity that's there. Because I think that's the challenging thing. I mean, I don't know, maybe from a creator standpoint, I feel like continuity can be very binding, and it's like you have to work within a certain confine of a storyline. I think that's where it can be dangerous. But yeah, I mean, I think new characters telling new stories that don't necessarily have to be related to what happened in Endgame,
Yeah.
I think that's where it can continue to evolve and move forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like even I was a little bit peeved that Iron Man was such a big presence in the Spider-Man movies. Um, let him breathe, man. Let Spider-Man be Spider-Man, right? But yeah, there is a pitfall with these continuity movies that they're all connected, so they might reference past stuff too much. So yeah, that's something to watch out for sure. Now, what about DC movies? Much maligned. Christian and Rainier, you've probably heard an earful of people talking shit about DC movies.
Lots.
No, Christian, you might have an interesting perspective because you're a big DC fan, but you actually dislike a lot of these more recent DC movies, right? So, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Let's see. Well, I think with yeah, I didn't really care. There's like definitely a few I didn't care for. I think with DC's universe, I think their first few movies off the ground, um, I didn't really care for it, even though I was like, oh well, I guess I'll go see it again. Because I'm just that kind of fan, I guess. Um, and so like I think that I will give Marvel, like, they have the singular vision of the MCU, whereas DC, you could definitely see there was too many fingers in the pie. Um, and that, like, even now DC's movie continuity is kind of a mess, and they have like several different shared universes. Whereas Marvel has that singular MCU. Um, but I think where DC really shines are kind of just the one-off trilogies or the one-off movies. I think when we talk about the MCU formula, um, I think a lot of that formula actually came from Batman Begins. I think that's where you really see the Nolan trilogy kind of really cemented what the superhero trilogy should look like. And I think The Dark Knight, personally, is still, I think, the best superhero film that's ever made, that's, you know, been made. And I think there's something about Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker that was so like, it was like I felt like I was in a trance just watching him, just because he was so intense on screen. You really felt like it became the Joker, and you felt the intensity when he held the knife to people's mouths and told them a story. And I think that DC kind of holds that, like, kind of very upper crust, and also a lot of kind of what's at the bottom, whereas I think Marvel personally gets a lot of the in between, if that makes sense. I think that there's certain movies that I think like really make a huge buzz, that really make a critical buzz. It's funny that the last 3 movies that the Joker have been in, the last 3 live action movies, have all won Oscars. Joker, which won Best Actor and I think Best Soundtrack. Suicide Squad won Best Makeup, and then The Dark Knight, which won Best Supporting Actor for Heath Ledger. And so I think that also just highlights a general strength of DC, where I think DC is just really good at making the singular one-off stories that change everything, in a sense, that aren't really tied to continuity, but really just blow up, in a sense. Like Frank Miller's Dark Knight, and Year One, All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison, just to name a few comics. I think even The Long Halloween is, I think that's technically in Grant Miller's universe, which wasn't really like the general DC universe. And so I think they have, even if they don't have that big, powerful, multi-connected universe, DC has those singular movies that you can just watch over and over.
Yeah, the Nolan films, like, I agree. Like Dark Knight, Batman Begins, probably the best superhero films. And the reason why I say that too is because I feel like you take superhero out of it, they're just great movies. Like, they're really well told stories with great cinematic takes. Like, it's taken out into the real world. They're just great movies. And yeah, Batman's in it. I think the tough part with, like, our current Justice League and Batman vs Superman is that, like, they were coming off the heels of MCU's like already established like singular vision. And I'm sure there was a lot of like, well, we got to make it like Marvel. Like, we have to have a shared universe. And that's something I really hate, actually. Like, now it's just like, wow, well, DC doesn't really have a shared universe. Like, why do they have to have a shared universe just because Marvel has it?
Yeah, that's a good point. You could argue that the Marvel effect kind of had an adverse reaction to DC. They tried too much to be like Marvel because Marvel was so successful with the movies at the time, right?
That's the thing that's happening with a lot of like Disney movies too. Like, I think in Tangled, there's like, I think in Frozen, I think Rapunzel makes an appearance. In Moana, like, Sven makes an appearance. Now everyone's like, oh, what universes do they live in? Are they in a shared universe? See, now there's this thing where everyone's looking for a shared universe in every movie just because it's under the same company title.
Yeah.
Godzilla versus King Kong.
There you go.
Yeah, Monsterverse.
Fast and Furious and Jurassic World.
There you go.
Happens.
It's going to keep going. It's going to keep happening.
Yeah, I liked how you guys brought up DC movies that were outside of the DC shared universe, like the Nolan Dark Knight trilogy. Absolutely. The Richard Donner Superman came up. Great movies. I would argue that Marvel movies aren't just the MCU, right? What preceded the MCU is definitely worth bringing up, I think. First and foremost, the Blade movies. Awesome. and the
Spider-Man
Spider-Man,
too.
yeah, the Raimi Spider-Man movies, and
But
the
also
go ahead.
the X-Men and Deadpool
Yes,
movies.
X-Men, absolutely. I was gonna say that myself. So yeah, um, a lot of great stuff. Um, yeah,
What's sad though,
even MCU aside, I think there are great Marvel movies.
what's sad though is that a lot of those movies don't come to light first because the MCU shines so brightly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, dude, I love to bring up the fact that there might not have been an MCU if it hadn't been for Blade, for the Raimi Spider-Man movies or the X-Men movies, right? Might not have happened. They led the way. So again, going to that know your history thing, you know, there's a cause and effect to all of this, right? So it's good to know what has happened in the past. All right, a few minutes left. Any final thoughts about DC versus Marvel?
We didn't talk about Joel Schumacher's Batman.
I guess at one point against DC, you could say is that Batman and Robin was such a bad movie, it almost completely killed the superhero movie until Blade revived it.
I feel like it's just the intentions of the movies. Like Batman and Robin, that movie was made to sell toys. So it was destined to fail, you know? And then like,
Yeah.
Batman vs Superman, that was made to start a DC universe. And like, how do you start a universe when you don't have like all the puzzle pieces in play for all the chess pieces in play first?
Yeah. But I think that's a point for Marvel. I don't think a Marvel movie has really hit the depths of Batman and Robin. Even I enjoyed the Howard the Duck movie to some degree.
I don't know. Have you seen Elektra? I don't know.
Oh, I haven't.
Fantastic Four movie. I really didn't.
Fantastic Four. Okay. Yeah, we did an episode about the worst superhero movies ever, and both sides have cranked out some stinkers, no question.
I will say one last thing I want to say is like, because of this whole Marvel DC comics fandom, like Image has also put some pretty good content out there because of the rise of comic interests, from this fandom. Like,
yeah, talk about pushing the envelope.
Yeah.
Invincible, The Boys, Walking Dead.
Spawn.
Yeah.
Are you guys all watching Invincible, by the way?
Oh, it's amazing.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Oh my goodness.
Not caught up yet, though.
Henry, have you seen it yet?
No, I haven't.
Oh, dude,
I
okay,
hear
you gotta
great.
watch it.
That sounds awesome.
There's one thing I'd like to say though. I think the one thing that Marvel will always have that DC has never had is someone like Stan Lee.
Yeah.
Like Stan Lee is clearly
Mr.
an
Comics.
ambassador for Marvel and just comics in general. But I don't think DC. I can't think of a single person that's at DC that was the equivalent of Stan Lee.
Like, I guess what although I think one thing I would put against Marvel and the talent is that Marvel does have a habit of losing some of their best talent. Going back to the big Image walkout where the 7 guys to create their own company so they could have more creative freedom. And now one of those artists, Jim Lee, is now like the head of the chief creative officer, and I get on also like Jack Kirby, I think ended up going to DC. So that's my pot shot, I guess, at Marvel. Even though, Stan Lee is Mr. Comics, and I think he really pushed the envelope.
Yeah, that's solid. I think the argument for Marvel goes a long way with Stan Lee. Maybe devil's advocate a bit though is I think with Stan Lee there's some complexity with his story. Christian, you mentioned like some notable departures at Marvel. I think Stan Lee was kind of part of that. Like the big one you mentioned, Jack Kirby. Stan Lee had a history of not being the coolest coworker, I guess you could say at times. And I think he had a bit of a habit to steal the spotlight from his co-creators,
I'm
so
curious to hear that
there's
side.
that. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear that side because no one gets their claim to fame by being a nice guy like that. Like there's certainly got to be some dirt under the rug somewhere.
Yeah. From what I've heard, Stanley could have been a little cooler about sharing the spotlight and that sort of thing. Um, and just, look at the departures. The fact that Jack Kirby left at all is just kind of sad, so there is that. But I think we can get to wrapping up. Like I said, I don't think this conversation ever ends. We can continue on, but certainly some great points have come up today. With that, we can wrap up the episode. This is Farewell from Henry, Rainier, Porfirio, and Christian.